Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Social and Economic Progress. Uh, it's a great day for us because when we publish a report, it's always a nice moment to share findings, to share research, to share work. So that's what brings us together here. The launch of this new report, How China Engages South Asia. It's a heavy piece. We don't have copies for you all, but we have certainly all of the chapters online. Please engage with them, please read them, and give us your feedback. What we thought of doing today here, besides formally launching this, is have a discussion around this paper. 2, 3 remarks about this to put the context of this project. This is the type of work that we like doing in my team here at the Foreign Policy Studies program at CSEP. We like to drill deep, do collaborative work. And as you all know, we've invested deeply in the neighborhood in India's periphery, which is in the news for many reasons, including for Operation Sindoor, but also for China's rising footprint in the region. So that's something we've been working on for 5, 6 years now with my colleagues. This is one aspect of what we call the Samband Initiative on regional connectivity, on South Asia, on the neighborhood. This is the second report that we're launching, that we're bringing together to understand a bit this big China that is present, increasingly resident in India and across India's neighborhood. Unfortunately, Ambassador Menon cannot be here today. He asked me to transmit his apologies to all of you. He had an urgent meeting and was forced to skip this meeting. But he's really been the person who's pushed us to do this from the beginning. He's believed in this. This is some of work that normally you do before policymakers come to you. And then now, fortunately, we've had a lot of interest from across government of India, private sector, foreign governments, friends of India on this project. So that's always rewarding for us. But I want to emphasize that this project really started with an idea that Ambassador Menon, my co-conspirator, Professor Jabin Jacob, sitting here, and myself had a few years ago, which is let's just examine what this China is, and let's not do it alone. Let's do it through the phenomenal network of scholars that exist in other countries. Let us hear and listen from them what they think about China. And that project then benefited from a lot of support here at the institution. I want to acknowledge Lavish Bandari, the president of CSEP, who's been also a firm believer. Perfect timing, Lavish. You walking into the room as I thank you, Lavish. Good timing. I was saying about how impact does not grow on trees. We hope it does, but it comes from support, from fundings, resources, and people, including another person sitting here to my right, Shruti Jargad, who's our China analyst, has studied in Taiwan, has studied in Beijing, and has been also instrumental in bringing this study to its second phase, Shruti, and all the others who've worked on it before, including other people on the neighborhood, like Riya Sinha, Nitika Nayar, etc. But anyway, just to tell you this journeys, these reports don't come out of nowhere. They're a lot of work. They require resources, they require time, and it's not the end of the journey either today. It's, in fact, given the inputs and the requests we're getting at the beginning of a journey, because for the first report, for example, we spent a lot of time across the neighborhood with our scholars and contributors in Kathmandu, in Dhaka, and Colombo in 2023, Jabin, right? We traveled across the region to then discuss the first report, and here's now the second report with 12 more case studies. Anyway, with that, let me just run you briefly to the project and what the outputs of this project have been over 3, 4 years. And then what we thought is, let's move beyond the report. You can all read it. We will discuss it. We've had seminars, workshops. We'll have many more of these. But what we want to talk is more of an open discussion about China and South Asia. And for that, we benefit from 2 guest speakers here today. Shruti will introduce them, but we have Professor Yasmin from Dhaka University, who graciously hosted us back in 2023 at Dhaka University, one of South Asia's oldest IR departments, or the oldest one, in fact, Jabin, right? And also George Cook, who's the director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Sri Lanka and Colombo, George leads what actually was one of the most prominent and still is, and I'm sure will continue being prominent regional think tanks in South Asia that has been built on the foundations of collaborative work across the region, something that I've argued used to be more in the 2000s than today. Choose any topic, for example, I see Sandhya, my colleague here from the health team, on pandemic preparedness, etc. There was more collaboration in health in this region in the 2000s than today. So we're going backwards in some cases in terms of habits of cooperation and exchanges in this region. Anyway, on this report, briefly, I'll just tell you why this matters. I think you all here because you know it matters. Otherwise, you would not be here, I guess. And that's why we didn't have. That's why we have so much interest in this. Second, what the sort of driving forces of our research project are, and then the two phases of the report that we have done over the last 3-4 years now. I mean, you all here. I don't need to convince you, but um, China has just um, risen in South Asia over the last 10-15 years, particularly post Belt and Road Initiative 2013. Though, as you will know in the introductions and the chapters that Jab and I co-authored, we remind people that this is in many ways not a completely new China. In fact, from the work we've done, we often see Chinese discourses on saying that China is just reappearing in the region. It was a resident power. It was an important player in this region, and it is only rekindling, reviving its presence. But for sure, we have a new story, which is, in simplistic terms, a post-2013 story across 3 dimensions. We have the history that you know on on China's trade investments in the region. A few indicators here. How China, from an economic dimension, is much more a player today than it was 10, 20 years ago. In terms of Ambassador Studio asking me for the comparative figures on trade, but also investments that are rising across the region. Deepal, for his Carnegie report in 2021, mapped this graphically, as you can see. So there's an economic story of rise of China as an economic player. There's a rise also on the defense side in terms of its military presence. We've seen the news about the PLA ships doing surveillance and mapping in the Indian Ocean region. We saw nuclear-powered submarines from the PLA Navy docking in Colombo over the last 10-15 years. So certainly a new presence of China also in the military and defense field. Particularly, we examined 2 cases, I think, in our case of Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, and also the intangible presence. I mean, you can see a ship and a vessel docking in the Colombo port, but you don't see the doctrines and the trainings and the cooperation, in some cases, interoperability happening at the technical and doctrinal level between the armed forces of China and neighboring countries. Third, of course, the political history. You see just this mapping that Deep did in 2021 in a study looking at the levels of visits between China and South Asian countries has risen, as you see, particularly post 2020. But also new types of engagements, visits, party-to-party diplomacy, something we examine in both reports. So there's a new political nature also to the Communist Party of China's, in particular, presence and that party state's presence across the neighborhood. What did we want to examine? One, the themes and sectors. Where does China play a role? Two, who are the partners that China engages in these countries? Three, what are the tools and methods and instruments and modus operandi of China engaging these teams, these partners in certain sectors? Four, how impactful, very difficult question. We've been struggling this over 2 reports, but how do you measure that impact? How impactful has it been? Ambassador Menon has this phenomenal phrase that he keeps reminding us, which is anticipatory compliance. He argues that many South Asian countries often comply to China without China even requesting compliance. So they're just hoping for benefits from support from China and therefore acting. That is a form of influence, even if it's not a required, requested, coerced form of influence from China. And finally, how's China learning, adapting from its presence? So there's also a dynamic process in how China is showing up in the neighborhood that we've learned and we'll talk more about. Objectives is mapping exercises. We as researchers like to map and just build knowledge based on what the empirics, what the evidence is in the neighborhood. Build regional capacity. We've worked now with 20 plus scholars from this neighborhood. We're not doing this with Australia or Japan or European scholars. We're doing this with China experts and country experts from this region, building a collaborative network of scholars in this region. So we're now at 20 plus. build comparative knowledge also because we know so much about China and Europe, China and Africa, China and Latin America. And this was also one of the projects with DNA that we wanted to do this in South Asia and then compare. So we've had a lot of interesting exchanges also with sinologists from across other regions who've told us how they examine China and Europe and compare that to China in South Asia. Drivers of the project, this is the first, therefore, project that we've done in this region beyond the tangible material trade and other economic dimensions and security dimensions, describing the knowledge gap that existed that we kept being asked about, what is China up to, what is China doing. We focused on case studies. We're big firm believers in case studies in my program because they really allow you to then interpret and not just generalize. And therefore also analysis of evaluation. We struggle a lot because a lot of people like to glorify or demonize China. That's the immediate impact we get from scholars in the policymaking community. We try to push people and our scholars, and they've done a fantastic work in terms of just describing and mapping how China does what it does in these neighboring countries the last 10 years. There's a team who's been working on this, now on the second report, Ambassador Menon, Jabin from Shivnada University, and Shruti. Coming to this first report that we did, we looked at themes, partners, and tools as mentioned. We had 8 case studies. You see them here. I won't go into details because you've seen that report, or you can again pull it up on our CSEP website. But there are 8 case studies across different themes, from party-to-party diplomacy to political party-to-party relations, to social media, a case study on Facebook in Sri Lanka, for example, and charm offensive in terms of soft power and public diplomacy. India's centrality drives Chinese engagement in the region. It is an important but not the only point that drives Chinese engagements. Second, China pays a lot of attention to setting the mood, language. Jabin, you've constantly reminded us of that, and that's why we have 2 sinologists here who can decipher that language and help us understand how China sets a linguistic, phrasal mood when it engages with countries, and that has costs and consequences. China employs both traditional and new media in spreading its message, much faster, dare we say, than India in employing new media in engaging in its foreign and economic diplomacy. China learns from its mistakes very quickly. We know the story in Myanmar and how quickly they regrouped after problems in Myanmar and setback in the mining sector in particular. And China is increasingly becoming experienced and comfortable with engaging a variety of actors, subnational, for example, private sector groups, industry. So we see much more of that, and we have more of that in our second report. Outreach and impact, again, something we've loved doing, which is, we work in collaboration. Research cannot be done in these rooms here at CSEP. We traveled across the region. We had dozens of workshops online with our authors. Again, the same thing this time. And we eventually, when the fun times come out and our fantastic communications team at CSEP produces these reports, then we can go around and engage policymakers. That meant meeting the Prime Minister of Nepal at that point, for example, was interested in understanding what we had learned about China in Nepal. That also meant working at universities, think tanks across the region, launching, discussing, and thinking of the next steps, of which the second report is an embodiment of. Here it is, what we're launching today. Same as previously, case study, thick description, understanding China's modus operandi across different themes. Here you can see a few of the sectors that we look at. Partners, actors in these countries, and the variety of actors that China has engaged. Not only different actors, but also in different languages, for example, in local languages. So you need a lot of cultural sensitivity if you're an embassy of China in Colombo to engage with a variety of actors in Sri Lanka. For example, Tamil-speaking actors. So we see a lot of that happening in China. And again, and I know we're not having an India discussion today, but there's a lot to learn here, how other states should and must engage. Okay, so this is a story about also learning from how China has developed the skills, the tools, the strategic capacity, the area studies, the linguistic expertise of its diplomats. Its industrial groups have developed environmental and social clearance norms that they are taking to these countries. There's a lot there happening, actually, that is very rich and worthwhile looking at and maybe learning from. And the tools that I was talking about different instruments to engage. I want to run you through to the heart of the paper, which are these 12 case studies, which are amazing scholars from Afghanistan, from India, from Pakistan, from Nepal, from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, from Myanmar. Unfortunately, we could not include the Maldives and Bhutan this time. We had proposals, but we had to rethink how to engage them, and sometimes difficult to get case studies. People, in fact, often are not comfortable to write about China in these countries, talking of challenges. They're very worried about the consequences about writing about China. They're happy to write about India and criticizing India. We see a lot of that in the neighborhood, but they're extremely concerned and worried about writing about China. So we, as scholars, we have to deal with that. We have to tell them, listen, this is a study that is a research study. Please tell us, please write about a case that you think is worth examining, that we can learn from. That was our philosophy. We have Iram Ashraf, who has a fabulous study on how China has given BRI awards to hundreds of recipients across Pakistan. It's a quantitative case study, data set that she has built across sectors, and looking how China has used these think tanks, journalists, academics, industrial entrepreneurs, and given them these awards and cultivated them in its sense. Kalyan Bandari is a great study on the heritage diplomacy in Nepal, monuments. And we know the importance of Lumbini and the whole Buddhist heritage in Nepal and what geopolitical implications it has in terms of Dalai Lama succession, the role of Buddhism in international politics. He has a study looking how China has engaged in heritage conservation and diplomacy efforts with political interests, obviously, in Nepal. Hazrat Bahar from Afghanistan wrote about China's public diplomacy in Afghanistan and the role of the media. And you would think, oh, what Afghan media is there? Well, there was a very vibrant media community till 2021 in Afghanistan. We know how much the West has pumped in money to engage the media in Afghanistan. But there's also a Chinese story, how they've equipped, trained journalists, and also shared norms and values of a very different kind of journalism in Afghanistan. Obviously different one from the American and Indian type of journalism, which is a much more open, transparent journalism. Fourth, we have a case study by Anand Krishnan. Anand, you're there. There's Anand Krishnan from Shivnari University. Anand has a study on the smartphone manufacturing companies from China that are in India and have been mindful of Indian smartphone consumer preferences and also of regulatory constraints and contexts in India. So we're not only looking at other countries. I mean, India has also been a part of the study in the first report with Anand Krishnan, the other Anand Krishnan, and here the Anand D. Krishnan, who's written to us about this telecom sector and the manufacturing sector. Dilini from Sri Lanka is a professor at Colombo University, a legal scholar, has actually something that we would like much more of, right, Jabin? We should have tens of studies at this point in this country if we want to respond in any way to China and also support Indian companies to go abroad, which is how have Chinese investments in Sri Lanka shaped the regulatory and legal framework in Sri Lanka to make it more easy for other investments, for current and future investments. So this is, of course, behind the scenes regulatory and legislative influence that Chinese SOEs and the PRC in its diplomatic might has been able to craft. And she looks at the implications of that on Sri Lankan public law infrastructure in particular. Rustam Ali Serat from Afghanistan looks at Chinese diplomacy in Afghanistan from a mediation perspective. You'll remember that in the first report, we had a study on the Chinese mediation efforts on the Rohingya issue between Bangladesh and Myanmar. We take that forward with this case study on Afghanistan. And bottom line, we often make a lot of noise about China, the political mediator in India's periphery. Both case studies suggest that the mediation attempts haven't been that consequential. Okay? But they have attempted, it's about a first stepping stone often. It's creating the space and with a strategic horizon of maybe doing much more 5, 10, 15 years from now. So sometimes starting small seems to be the Chinese way. What is it, Shruti? Every march begins, every revolution begins with one small step. Isn't that Mao's teaching? Or Dang? By? No, precedes Confucian. So every long journey begins with that small step, and mediation is maybe also a story that tells us about the impact that China can have as a political mediator. I'm sure you're all thinking about Operation Sindoor, but this can be seen in many other theaters that are maybe less visible, but equally important to study. Amaratiha from Myanmar has a great study, again, on a type of mediation, which is Chinese influence over different ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar. It's a country in a state of civil war where almost 2/3 of the territory are now in control of non-state actors. And he looks at Operation 1027 to see how China has developed the skills, the tools, the methods with limited effects, partial effects we can discuss, of course, to shape the political and conflict environment in Myanmar to protect its interests, including, for example, its gas and oil pipelines. Rubiat Saimun from Bangladesh works on the military to military or defense diplomacy part. He's looking at how, beyond hardware, we know China has been traditionally, since the 1990s or even before, the main supplier of defense equipments to Bangladesh, but how the Chinese are actually working beyond that and developing what he calls hardware, which is defense diplomacy in the intangible ways. So we talk a lot about submarines or frigates from China, a lot more attention, both him and also Bhagia Senaratne from Sri Lanka argue that there is beyond that, there's a military diplomacy angle that is intangible, that is about minds, about hearts, about doctrines, about operations, about new spaces of warfare. We talk a lot about cyber, for example, these days. This is where China is investing in these countries. It's looking ahead of the curve, and instead of just selling the equipment, it's also developing the frameworks, the cognitive frameworks, and the norms that are shaping the future militaries of these countries. Ajaya Kanal, again, a good friend in Nepal who's been with us for a long time on this project, looks at subnational engagements. So he looks at how the PLA, Chinese police forces, Chinese bureaucracy, Chinese political leaders have engaged in the northern province of Nepal. As you know, Nepal now has become, since 2008, a federal republic with different degrees of autonomy for its provinces. So instead of, again, now gaze on Kathmandu and the capital in China and Nepal through Kathmandu, he's actually inviting us to look, and his case study does it formidably, how China is looking at the subnational levels of engagement in the provinces, of course, close to the Tibetan Autonomous Region for obvious interests for China. The last two are by Devinder Kumar, again from Shiv Nada University, another promising sinologist here in India that we have. He's looking at Chinese influence operations in the harder edges of what we call influence operations in the Tibetan diaspora in India and Nepal. This is a story we don't know much about, but is very important for obvious reasons in terms of succession of the Dalai Lama and also the security and the well-being of the Tibetan community across this neighborhood, but particularly in Nepal and India. So he examines to what the various ways through which China is also trying to build inroads with the Tibetan community in exile. Last, Sanjana Tutuva, maybe the cherry on the cake, the only reincident contributor from the first report, because his first study was so formidable that we had to split it into two. His first study was on Facebook. Second one is on Twitter, or what is X now. And this is the closest to an influence operation where he actually, through network mapping of social media accounts, argues that there is a direct digital footprint of the state on the social media sector in Sri Lanka to distribute and share different narratives. So he looks at timestamps, he looks at accounts, you can read his paper, but makes a very solid case for an influence operation that is certainly behind the scenes and what we would call a covered operation in that sense. Good. Key findings, I'll end with this. Range and creativity of calibration are central features. So there's a different range. There's also creativity, calibration. This is not a single China. This is an evolving China across different sectors. China is preferring bilateral engagements across the region and engaging bilaterally with these countries in its different ways. But most recently, I think you're all reminded of the odd Pakistan, Bangladesh, China trilateral that happened early this year. There's also toying around with different sub-regional groupings that the Chinese are experimenting with, what we generally call that trying to develop a new SARC. I think the Chinese are far too much intelligent to develop a new SARC. I think we're different region now, but it's certainly developing with different institutional frameworks of clusters of countries that they're engaging, which are beyond the bilateral, while the bilateral remains the most important one. 3, China's showing both capacity and willingness to take risks, experiment, and innovate. This is critical if you're developing policy. You need to think how this region is going to look 10, 20, 30 years from now, and then work backwards. Something maybe we can learn more about as we develop our own neighborhood policy here. 4th, China's efforts have not always been successful, exposing the limits and importance of long-term analysis. So I think you see a lot of alarmist narratives often that the Chinese are controlling, that India, South Asia, that India's lost South Asia, that countries have no agency, as if they were lame ducks waiting for the Chinese to tell them what they're doing. Wherever we go across the neighborhood, countries are well aware about the opportunities and the risks that China brings, that other actors bring. They are struggling to fine tune and calibrate their policies to navigate this competitive field, but they certainly have a lot of agency. There's a lot of thinking. Again, when we meet people like the Prime Minister, former Prime Minister of Nepal, decision makers, bureaucrats, academia, think tanks, there's a lot of thinking, a lot of capacity. So we also have a lot to learn from how they are looking at this region and also of the limits of Chinese influence. Policy implications, this is an argument that we've made repeatedly. In fact, we have a paper coming up, Shruti, I know we'll discuss more about it, about the need to invest in a China-focused research ecosystem. I'll leave that more to Jabin, but we've done a bit of this at CSEP, but there's formidable institutions across the country. They need to be endowed, supported in India, across the region, with more expertise on China. That starts with knowing the Chinese language, Mandarin. It starts with spending time in China. It starts in understanding China from a Chinese perspective before we study it only from a downstream. That's a policy research ecosystem that is very important and is rather neglected, if I dare say, in this country. Learning from Chinese, I think I've mentioned this, diplomatic practices and outreach. There's things to learn, there's things to ignore, there are things that need to be stopped. Something that we don't discuss much, but is what is the nature of Chinese influence that has implications for the democratic, open, transparent governance that most of these countries here in South Asia share? What is the political impact? When a party state shows up and tells you this is how we do governance, this is how you should do governance. Forget in geopolitics, on health, on education, on journalism, on media, on transparency of investments. There is a different model. That model has, of course, consequences, political consequences, also for countries in this region. I'll end at that and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
On. Yeah, the mic is working, right? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Xavier. You went only 10 minutes over time. And as the but you've done an excellent job of putting together what we have done here at CSEP in the last several years, from bringing together a community of scholars, from doing multiple rounds of workshops, of proofreading, editing, and then bringing together this beautiful report, if I may say so. Had a hand in designing the cover. But thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you so much for joining us today. What we are doing here, what Dr. Xavier presented, was what we do in the report. And what we want to do in this panel discussion is to go a step ahead. China is rising. China is engaging with multiple actors. China is engaging in multiple sectors. But so what? What are the implications? What is the impact of that rise of China? And we have together here for you an excellent panel to do just that. Tell you the impact and the implications of China's rise in South Asia. Today we have Mr. George Cook, who is a diplomatic historian, and he's also a visiting lecturer at Bandanaike International Diplomatic Training Institute. And he has now chosen an academic career and will be talking more about China's presence in Sri Lanka. We also have Professor Lailufar Yasmin from Bangladesh, and she is the professor at Department of International Relations, University of Dhaka. And we are very, very glad to have both of you here. Then on my left are the two editors of the report, China in How China Engages South Asia in the Open and Behind the Scenes. Dr. Constantino Xavier, who's a senior fellow at CSEP, and Professor Jabin Jacob, who is an associate professor at Shivnadar University and also a non-resident fellow at CSEP. And myself, I've been involved with this project. I've been fortunate to be involved with this project for the last 2 years. And I'm a research analyst here at CSEP. Okay, so let me not go over time and ask Mr. Cook, can you hear us? Okay,
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I would want to start with you. And we talked about the limitations, and we talked about having more of a sense of what China can and cannot do in the region. So in case of Sri Lanka, do you see that limitations are becoming apparent? And if there are examples of that you could highlight?
Well, thank you first and foremost for the invitation to join the panel, representing the Regional Center for Strategic Studies, not any other institution. But just to go into reflecting also on what Tino has already shared with us, and this is where this presence, this growth of this presence, this is where it's time now to start understanding that this is very much a strategized foreign policy on the part of a country like China, which is really full throttle ahead. That's exactly what we are seeing happening over here in Sri Lanka. And certainly, when we look at the case studies and we look at the report, when we look at some of the other findings that have come out from this region, this is what we are able to understand in a very clear manner. There is a strategy, there is a process, there is a goal, and it is being achieved. Whether we want to look at these in terms of limitations that are apparent, there aren't too many that we can find, that we are coming across. It is in every sector we see this involvement, this growing presence, engagement, which we are not seeing from other countries in the region or countries internationally. We are not seeing that scope, that ability. I guess the word is ability here, where certainly this country has much ability to use soft power, to use it in a plethora of areas. We can talk about some of those areas as we go along. There's everything from education, and we're talking about universities, select think tanks, schools. We're looking at the public sector. We're looking at reaching out into associations or civil society. We're talking about how there is a reach into chambers, various chambers that we have in the economic realm. Where we're seeing this in terms of vehicles. We're seeing a massive boost in the sale of certain vehicles coming from this country. It's across the board. And I don't think any country other than China has that capacity to do that or is doing that. If you monitor, if you watch, if you do research in this area in Sri Lanka, it is quite astonishing.
Okay, thank you so much. So I see that there are less limitations, and we'll come to the question of what other powers or other countries should be doing in the way China is. But coming to you, Professor Yasmin, today is a significant day and in Bangladesh and in the region. But related to that, I want to ask you, to what extent is this new regime similar to or different from Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's time in their approach to China? Is there a pro-China tilt that has been a cause of worry in the region or in New Delhi at least? So can you please talk about that? You're muted.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And it's nice to see Constantino and Professor Jacob. And I can only think of good times when you were back in Dhaka. So it's a very important question, and also on a very important day when we are celebrating how the country achieved a different kind of liberation. And how we are sort of working to go towards a democratic future. So with that, foreign policy is an issue where a lot of talks have happened. And often we are also asking this question, as you asked, that are we being pro-China, or how are we sort of balancing our relationship with the others? So the first one, whether we are being more pro-China than the previous regime, then we have to go a little back and sort of assert that the last regime was not entirely pro-China. the last regime rather maintained a balance between China and India, although you might find that questionable. But as we can see with Sheikh Hasina planning to go to, I mean, deciding to go to Delhi, not to Beijing, it shows how it was a pro-Indian foreign policy. In terms of its economic footprint, one cannot deny that it happened at a higher level during last 15.5 years than before. It is simply because of a lot of business strategy coming from the Chinese side, the business opportunities that Bangladeshi businessmen thought that they would find it better from China than any other countries of the world. As we'll discuss that in details a bit later, because I believe you have questions on that. This regime has to treat through very carefully, because it is going to leave us leave us to a new elected government. Before that, what it is trying to do, it is trying to attract foreign direct investment. It is trying to attract more business. It is trying to attract more sort of investment in the infrastructural areas, which are absolutely necessary at the moment. So therefore, I would say that this government, which initially sort of in one of his initial sort of statements, Professor Yunus, our chief advisor, stated that Bangladesh is looking for a relationship with its partners, allies, friends, neighbors on the basis of reciprocity, mutual trust, faith. So that is the principle we are basing on developing our relationship with China and with other countries as well.
Thank you, Professor. But I just have a follow-up question to this. So you see that China has cultivated a positive image in many countries in South Asia. Do you see, what reasons do you see? How has China managed to do that?
Okay, I'll first start with a few intangible area or soft diplomacy or charm offensive, however you call it. So George is here. So some of my Sri Lankan friends would say that the Chinese speak better Sinhala than the Sinhalese themselves. I would say they speak much better Bengali than we do. And I actually saw clips of Chinese singing Rabindra Sangeet, Rabindranath Tagore's songs from Shantiniketan in a like flawless Bengali. Not only that, here they have pages where several Chinese nationals, they are online all the time, and they are showing the cultural places to visit for Bangladeshis, and they are providing sort of examples. Then if you look at how China is sort of offering to be a hub of health for health related reasons as a destination to Kunming and some other places. So I had a chance to visit in one of such hospitals in Kunming, which is one of the top 10 medical institution in China in terms of heart-related sort of diseases. And they are going to offer halal food. They are going to offer translator, and they are going to provide all the other necessary sort of assistances. So these are some of the commitments that are making people to sort of grab these opportunities, because flight is not much expensive to go to Kunming, and then with a lot of doors being closed, for example India, and also a lot of other destinations being more expensive, Bangladeshis are thinking that we need to look for alternatives. So these are some of the sort of intangible areas. In some ways, some of them are tangible. But not only that, is the businessmen who I interviewed for one of my papers, who argue that it is easier to do business with the Chinese because they are almost always available. They have a large market for which they can provide you with competitive pricing. And not only that, they are also willing to sort of work around the clock. So there are a couple of things that Bangladeshi businessmen did not get from either from India or from European or American buyers. And not to mention that the visa regime for Bangladeshis are quite relaxed in China than any other sort of parts of the world. So these work as incentives for Chinese, having a Chinese footprint better in Bangladesh.
So taking forward this line of thought, In the report also, we find that there are both tangible and intangible aspects, and heritage is one of these areas that we cover in the first and the second report, what China is doing with Buddhist heritage reconstruction, with tourism. But we also find there are some things that are out in the open and there are some things that are behind the scenes. So this would include, for example, disinformation campaigns. Coming to you, Professor Jacob, with this question, there is this narrative of hidden deceptive ways of China. How is this different from what other countries would be doing? Why should we be noticing it or be worried about it? How is it different from, say, the US?
Okay, so first and foremost, I think increasingly none of it is hidden. None of it is deception. It's all out in the open, which is why people like us can do this kind of work. And the second part is that, of course, it's different. I think one difference is, of course, is that it's more effective. And one of the reasons why it's more effective, I think, is because they do the first part very well. That there's a lot of information, there's a lot of engagement out in the open. And the more engagement there is out in the open, the better your disinformation is, because you can always slip it in. And which is why the two chapters by Sanjana, the one on Facebook in Sri Lanka and the one on Twitter or X in Sri Lanka, is so important, because what he shows in his work is how the Chinese plan it all out. I mean, as Tino pointed out, the footprint is back in China. Everything, so the Chinese are working round the clock, and they're working around the clock because they have to push, certain narratives or certain messages, or the Chinese version of things at peak time in Sri Lanka. So that's the kind of effort that goes into it. And I want to sort of, bring up this point that Professor Yasmin just raised, which is of how, the Chinese speak better Sinhalese. I mean, where do the Chinese speak better Sinhalese? Chinese radio, Chinese television, they have Sinhala channels. And they have, by the way, they also have excellent Bengali channels. And the amount of effort that they put into language training, and not just Sinhala, Bengali, which you could say, or Tamil, which are major channels, major languages. Even a small language spoken, say Malagasy, spoken only in Madagascar, they have people studying it, right? So if that is the kind of effort that they put in, you can be sure then everything else will follow. So, I think in terms of effectiveness, in terms of the effort, the resources and the manpower they put in, and once you have studied Chinese, the people themselves will find ways in which you want to keep it up, right? You want to sort of, it's your career. I mean, okay, I should not say Chinese, and say Tamil and Bengali, because even, frankly, in India, even if you speak Chinese, I think there's not enough scope that goes into research. I mean, yes, there is enough to do in business, which I suppose, to cut to the very quick present, is one of the reasons why we have a lot of pressure on the government for re-engagement with China, because businesses need engagement with China, right? So, I mean, I would say essentially, I'm not so concerned about the disinformation, at least as far as India is concerned, because we have a certain approach to China. But I think it's what is obvious that we are ignoring. I mean, one of the points that Sanjana, and I'll stop with this, one of the points that Sanjana mentioned in the first report was that the Chinese embassy puts out more social media posts than the next 6 embassies put together. So I think that's a small step that each embassy could work on, right? I mean, each embassy will have somebody that speaks Tamil or Sinhala in Sri Lanka. So why is it that the social media is not active? So it's an effort, I think, that the Chinese are willing to put in, which is simply not visible in any other embassy.
Dr. Xavier, Professor Jacob just talked about Chinese resources, and here I would like to bring in Operation Sindoor and the India-Pakistan conflict and how China is being viewed in this whole conflict. Do you think this is a new China? Is it different from the past? And you've observed politics in South Asia for almost more than a decade now. So what is your sense? Is this a new China that we are witnessing?
Just to follow up on what Jabin also said, John, you forgot what you generally used to say, which is a party state.
Yep.
So, I mean, if you go by the basic,
I thought that was understood.
no, we forget. And I think, let me just remind, I mean, if we go with the basic identity of international relations theory, tell me who you are and I'll tell you how you act. So what should surprise us when the Communist Party of China organizes a workshop on governance in Kathmandu and will, of course, share what its own experience has been, its political experience of development. Why should it surprise us that in this study, separate study that Shruti and I did, will come out next month, where we examined 500 speeches of Chinese officials on South Asia, that they're not upset, but actually puzzled by the democratic persistence of South Asia. I mean, they're scratching their heads and saying, why are you guys still democratic? Don't you see it doesn't work? Don't you see that you're not going to develop as fast as we are? I'm being facetious here because these are the questions that represent the political identity of the Chinese state. As there is a Indian, a Sri Lankan, a Nepali identity that is political. And therefore, when China acts abroad, it is, like every other state, representing and impartially prescribing, funding, supporting, just as the United States of America did, just as the German party foundations did across Europe and still are doing here these days, their philosophy, their political interests, and what they think is right and what worked for them back home. Second, Operation Sindoor. I will go there, but not really go there, which is, Shruti, the question of order in South Asia. The Chinese, from what we learn in these case studies, and what I learned again from Jabin and Ambassador Menon, as we chat and discuss across the order, are again obsessed with an idea of a over thousands of years and hundreds of years. They want order for Asia. They want order for the world. They want also a certain order for this region. And that synthetic order, it's an obsession with recreating and reshaping the balance of power, economic, cultural, political in this region, is very different from other visions of order in this region. We have cooperative visions of order, SARC, BIMSTEC if you want, India's Gujarat doctrine, maybe neighborhood first policy these days. We also have what I would call an organic idea of order, which is the Indian vision of order, which has been very limited in its consequences and impact. I mean, do we have an economic order in South Asia today? No. In fact, we were closer to it in 2000 than we are today. We're talking about a monetary union and a trade union. Do we have a security order in South Asia? Operation Sindoor? Far from it. We have a total sense of disorder of the region, where the two biggest states are fighting each other. Do we have a sense of political order in this region, of joint values of governance and democracy, etc.? Partial at best, right? And certainly not created by India either. But I think India's experience has been one, an organic attempt of shaping the order. Chinese are telling us that they have certainly a sense of order that they want to achieve as soon as possible, as fast as possible, which comes with also dangers, because it's maybe the truth is maybe somewhere in the middle of the organic and the synthetic.
Thank you. That's a very thoughtful take. Not what we hear on the news these days, but thank you so much. I'll come back to you, Mr. Cook. We heard about the idea of order in South Asia, and there has been presence of other powers in the region as well. Do you think, specifically in the case of Sri Lanka, China's rise is displacing these powers, or is it creating avenues for other powers to cooperate? What is your take on that?
It certainly is displacing our power, other countries. Just to go back to that point that Professor Jacob made, where he said, quoting Sanjana's report, Sanjana's chapter, where the next 6 embassies, 6 missions have not, it's more than what they would put out. What's the reason for that? They're doing a lot more than the next 6 are doing collectively. That's what it boils down to. There is something happening every day somewhere in some sector, in some area, which is not happening with some of the other missions. So when it comes to the actual engagement, because to put things out on social media, a lot of times, what they are putting out would be events that they have had, engagements that they've had, discussions, donation campaigns, programs. Other countries are not doing that on that same scale. Hence, they do not have material to put out. When it comes to actually monitoring or trying to follow, if you only go to, for example, the website of the embassy, you're not going to see much of that information coming out. You do have, quite thankfully, they put out things like speeches, which are very important to understand thinking, to understand narratives. But of course, when you actually look at rural areas, donations that have taken place, schools, um, it can be on a large scale basis where it could be government to government. It could be something that is being done by people in that country who are contributing, who are supporting associations, supporting individuals in Sri Lanka in order to reach out to communities over here. It's widespread. And we can quite confidently conclude that there is no other country that has that same capacity. We're not seeing it. We certainly don't see it. Going back to that point that Professor Yasmin also made in terms of language capabilities, it is not only Sinhala, they have also mastered Tamil. They have taken it to a very high level. They have, and might have heard of this, where for ease of communication, rather than using a native name, they would take on an English name. There are many who have taken on a Sinhala name, might even be a name that would be considered a Tamil original name. So that's quite interesting. And that shows the passion, the commitment. It's as though everyone has been given a task. Your task is to go out there, learn this language, and do that on behalf of your country. Promote your country, take your country to a much higher level. And it's collective effort. It's each one has a role to play in this much bigger picture. And that's a massive takeaway at the end of the day when you see what is happening there. So is it encouraging others to do the same? Well, we hope so, because wider engagement is better across society, especially in a country like ours, which is a developing country. We are looking for much deeper, much greater, wider engagement internationally. As to whether that is happening, perhaps to some extent, there are some countries who are able to engage close, but I doubt very much that anyone is on par. Anyone is on par at the moment with China and China's engagement.
Professor Yasmin, I saw you nodding in agreement with that. So what do you think can other actors learn from China? Or let me make it more specific. What should India be doing? Learning or not learning, just observing what China is doing now in the region or in Bangladesh.
Of course, it's turning into a very interesting discussion. I'm learning from you, and I hope I can contribute as much. So the idea is that for India and for the rest of the world, I would like to sort of rephrase something George said, that it's a collective. What the Chinese are showing is a collective commitment to promoting their national interest, that you have to spread around with an idea that you are promoting the national interest of your country. For example, they speak about 1,000 or I'm not actually sure about the number, but the Bengali experts on teaching Bengali language, and they take them to different parts of China and they're teaching Bengali there. So we can see that how this kind of efforts and resources are invested for them to have those who are experts on Bangladesh, experts on Bangla language. But on the other hand, with our colonial mentality, we think that we have to first learn English. We have to communicate with English. We have to be able to dream in English, and then only we can represent ourselves to the wider world. That is exactly what the Chinese are not doing. So when you go to the immigration in the Beijing airport, you scan your passport, and the moment the scanning is finished, the instructions are in Bengali. Sort of automated voice gives you instruction in Bengali, and that actually something shows showing that they want to understand and respect the sort of culture, language, and they want to make things as as simple, as accessible as possible. On the other hand, in terms of other actors, we have not seen this kind of efforts, but we have rather seen promoting a different kind of a version of this is our ideology and you have to go along with it. This is something I believe is not working with not only Bangladesh or other South Asian countries, but with many parts of the world. So there is this, sort of entering to a society or a country with soft power charm and then turning into a sort of tangible relationship which will have some future. This is something I think the other countries must follow. China comes with a plan, as we read and hear, that comes with a plan for the next 100 years. Unfortunately, many other countries do not have any vision about how to engage with another country for the next 5 years. And this is where I think other countries are lagging behind. But particularly in terms of Bangladesh, I would rather argue that we do not see a direct clash among different powers who are bilaterally or multilaterally engaging with China. I would say their Bangladesh policy often aligns with China's Bangladesh policy. Maybe their efforts are not given on the same scale as China provides, but their interest in terms of engaging with Bangladesh, it does not differ very much than that of China, those of China.
So I'll just come back to the first question I had asked Mr. Cook. What are the limitations to Chinese power in Bangladesh? Because I see from your, we hear from your answer that China is getting a lot right, but what is it getting wrong?
At this moment, I'm afraid I do not see China is doing many things wrong, because as you have seen from January onwards, how China has engaged with different political parties. So I'm not sure if you have noticed, there was a BBC World report on how China is wooing Bangladesh as opposed to India's relationship with China. This was with regard to political parties' delegations' visit to China. So from then on, China has learned from its previous mistake of engaging with one political party. It is now engaging with all the political parties. So there has not only been BNP's visit, but there has been Jamaat Islami's visit. There has been visit of representatives from Khilafat Islam Majlis, from students representatives. So they are now engaging with all parties. This is, I would say, a far-sighted sort of policy in part of China, and they have openly sort of made statement that during the last regime, they were barred from engaging with other political parties. So to make a bold statement like that was quite something. But let's go back in 2019. I think it was right before the COVID, when Bangladesh Nationalist Party, BNP, and Awami League, at the party level, both of the parties sat together. I think that was one of the very last, example of cooperation between two political parties in Bangladesh, that on China question, both of them decided that they will have a robust relationship with China. From the party level of BNP and Awami League decided that. Unison did not exist for a long, for quite a long time. But we can see that how China has understood that it is a political suicide to sort of engage with one political party, at least in case of Bangladesh. So they now are engaging with Islamist political parties, their right-wing political parties, as well as BNP and center sort of political parties.
Thank you. Thank you. That was an excellent example. And we also have a study in the first report where we examine how China is engaging with different political parties in Nepal, carrying out party-to-party diplomacy, and as well in Sri Lanka. But carrying forward the discussion, and we will soon open for questions from the audience as well. Professor Jacob, what do you see as the role of other countries, US, Japan, Australia, in South Asia, given China's rise? Are they paying more attention to South Asia? Is that a trend? Or what, is India a partner of all of these countries in paying more attention to South Asia?
All right. Okay. I mean, the answer to this, I think, has to sort of refer to some of what our friends and neighbors have been telling us. I think we make a mistake if the approach is to see, what is it that China is getting wrong or might do wrong. I think what our neighbors are telling us is precisely the opposite. Look at what China is getting right. And why is it that an authoritarian state is getting so much right when, those of us living in open societies are getting so much wrong? So, and China is attractive, not just in Sri Lanka or in Bangladesh, it's also attractive in India. And that's, I think, a concern that we should all sort of, at least those of us who are interested enough to come to this meeting in this room, I think that's a concern that we all share. So, I mean, now, is when I'll get back to this party state business. The objectives of the party state are very clear, right? But the means, I think the mistake that we make is to assume that the means of the party state are necessarily a reflection of the nature of that party state. The means can be very different. The means are extremely creative, and through 2 volumes, I think that's what our friends and neighbors have been telling us, that the means are extremely creative. And these are means that the Chinese party state has picked up from the Americans, has picked up from the Indians. They looked at India and said, look, all of India's border states speak the languages of neighboring countries, right? Punjab speaks Punjabi, West Bengal speaks Bengali. So what is the advantage that the Indians have over us? They speak the languages. And so how do we overcome that language, that disadvantage? We pick up the languages. And now they do it better than us. Doordarshan doesn't broadcast, or Doordarshan and All India Radio, none of them broadcast for more than a few hours in any of the languages of our neighborhood. The Chinese have 24-hour programming. The Chinese have journalists in all of these places. And by the way, where do the Chinese learn these languages? I mean, Professor Yasmin mentioned that the Chinese sing Rabindra Sangeet beautifully. They come and learn it in Shantiniketan. Yes, in Vishwabharati, right? So that's where they learn it from. And that's a regular exchange of Chinese students. I mean, of course, it stopped post Galwan, but that's where they have learned it from. They come and learn Hindi in Wardha, in Allahabad, and wherever. So, they have spent the effort to do it. So the means, I think, to confuse, to assume that because this is a party state, an authoritarian state, that they are not nimble or creative, I think that's the mistake that we make, right? So because they're good at this, they're able to sheath their motives. I think that's a lesson. Again, I think some of our neighbors are learning by and by that, I think, again, Professor Yasmin hinted at this. Over time, the more China gets involved in these countries, China will make mistakes and China will have missteps. And those are missteps that I think we see the biggest reaction in places like Pakistan. I mean, before Op Sindoor, I think the Pakistanis over 10 years of CPEC have actually said, well, CPEC doesn't actually do much in terms of economic well-being for the Pakistanis. CPEC is $25 billion worth of investment, right? Number one, that is not a figure that we have actually heard from the Pakistanis themselves. Pakistanis talk about $47 billion, but that's not the amount. $25 billion in a country of 200 million people, that's as if you're investing in a high-tech economy. For jobs, what's the job? I think about 25,000 jobs or less than 100,000 jobs. So those are figures that I think we tend to forget, but the Pakistanis are aware of it, and therefore they are actually responding to it. So the more they engage in these countries, the better their motives become, clearer. But I think we need to be able to do something. I mean, we need to be able to do 2 things. First, we need to be able to match. And second, we need to be able to do what we say that we are capable of doing as democratic open societies. And finally, I think competition is good for the smaller countries. As far as they are concerned, China and India, or the US, or Europe going at it with each other is good business for Bangladeshis, for Sri Lankans, for Nepalese. So what should we do? I think, do what we say we will do or what we can do, instead of constantly looking at the other guy. You can just do what we said that we will do. And I think implementation is really a big problem. The Chinese have built 10 or 1,000 bridges in Africa, okay, in the last 10 years. How many bridges has India built in South Asia? And I'll leave it at that.
I think Dr. Xavier is the best person to answer that question. How many bridges India has built in South Asia?
I'm talking real bridges, not metaphorical bridges. Yeah.
Well, there's that study that Ria and I did on the Hulaki Road, the postal road in Nepal, that was announced by Ambassador Shamsaran in 2003, and still is not completely built, right? And it's a road. I mean, it's a joke of a road, with all due respect. It's a 2000 road with 2 lanes and still hasn't been built. So much for delivery. But I agree, and as you rightly have heard me many times, I think India is doing more than ever. It is doing faster than ever. It is doing better than ever in delivery to the neighborhood. The paradox is that today this neighborhood, this order, has become a polycentric order, a very competitive field. Countries are growing, their economies are booming, the demands are more. 20 years ago, I would not hear many people in the neighborhood saying, please, India, we want to connect more with you. Today, that is the message I'm getting, my team of researchers is getting across the neighborhood. We want more of India, whether it's to balance China or because the demand is huge for infrastructure development, universities being built, roads, railways, technology, digital systems. That is a demand. So I think from what I learned of all these fabulous papers, that first, China thinks long-term. And I leave up to you whether we think long-term or other countries think long-term. We know certainly in Washington, D.C., there's someone who thinks nothing close to long-term these days and is shaping as we speak. And we're laughing, but it's shaping as we speak the jobs and food on the table in this largest region in the world of the next decades, which will have huge implications. And I've warned on this stage here many times last year about the risks of systemic collapse in this neighborhood. Okay, and I think what's happening, what Mr. Trump is doing, will have huge consequences. But coming back to China, long-term thinking. 2, capacity and resources, like German, I think I gave 2 very example. Capacity and resource means training diplomats, but also means something as simple as the UGC in this country in the 1960s setting up an area studies program. And if you look back at the area studies program the UGC set up in this system, it was to support policy making. And this country used to have some of the best experts on Nepal, on the political economy of Burma, on the rice economy of Burma, on Africa, on the Gulf. So I invite you all to think about the capacity we have in this country and other countries in terms of area studies. If you want to read Varun Sahni's 2011 piece in International Studies on the state of area studies in this country. That applies to China, that applies to Nepal, and to the think tanks as the one we're sitting here today. What is the expertise that we have on what the political structures, the economy, the demands are in these countries? What is our expertise? That's what China has realized 20 years ago as it built out its inroads, and it's serving China today. 3, an aversion to exceptionalism. If we think we're amazing and exceptional in this region of South Asia, we will not do much to change it. You have to work really hard to reshape and shape orders. 4, be proactive. Keep doing things. It's a theory of movement. That's what the Chinese are doing, right, Japan? They keep moving and adjusting. Now, if you're sitting back and not moving, you're not going to adjust, you're not going to learn. So I'm not a fan of the right or wrong. It's just keep moving, keep doing. That's what states do. That's we as individuals, what we do, that's how we grow. And finally, be humble. Deliver, listen, speak softly and sweetly, and carry a huge stick. That's what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in this region as we speak, including to India. Speak the softest tunes and carry the biggest stick, and not the opposite way. So I think, again, we're on the right way, other countries. There's a lot of thinking, and it's been actually good because I think India is doing, again, more than ever in the neighborhood. And we're doing the study in many ways because there's interest today. And there will be solutions that are happening, that are coming. And there'll be also space for a lot of coexistence between India, China, and other players. I mean, the pie is so big in this region. We're growing so fast. There's so many demands that it's not necessarily we're always going to compete, conflict with each other. I mean, if China was delivering weapons to Bangladesh in the 1990s, and it was not a threat or less of a threat, then why should it be today? I can see both arguments, but I think we should all step back and find space for competition, coexistence, and maybe, as we're doing another study at CSEP, cooperation maybe on energy and climate, for example, in a future that may be distant, maybe not. Let's see.
All right, thank you so much. And I can already see questions on people's faces right now. So I'll let you now put forth these questions. And we have about 25 minutes. So I'll request you all to keep your questions brief and to the point. Mr. Bhutalinga.
Thank you. Firstly, let me congratulate the team. Absolutely excellent project. I think the way it was conceptualized and the way it has been delivered by all the participants. I've actually attended almost all of the sessions so far, so I can say that very well done. So my questions are really to do with, how you could really build on this great work you've done. So the first question I have is about the term you use, which you call influence operations. Now, the term influence operations has a somewhat sinister tinge, and therefore it raises, to me at least, the questions of legitimacy. How much influence is legitimate? You're communicating a message, you're communicating something, that is bound to be influence. And as Jabin said, every country does that. How much of the influence is what you would call illegitimate, which I would term under the rubric influence operations? Now, it's not very clear coming out because illegitimacy can be legal. You might be breaching the law. It might be a question of morality. It might be sheerly a question of taste. So, okay, there are some edgy areas here, the sort of work on the Tibetan monks, which how much of that is free speech? And Chinese can take that argument, even though they're a totalitarian state, and because we are judging them from the point of view of free speech. How much of it is illegitimate? I think I say this because it detracts from what Jabin said about our studying it very carefully to learn lessons rather than detract from them. My second and last question is, Chinese are doing what they do well. If you look at manufacture, they're manufacturing toys for all countries around the world. When I visited factories there, I found there were assembly lines, so Italian toys, French toys, and so on. People learned those languages. So they focused on what they do well and have expanded it. So the point you asked about, or Javin asked, was it, I think to do what you do well, I think we should also focus on that, what we do well. I mean, we do IT well, we do digital well. For Africa, we've done a lot of good work on training teachers and doctors. A lot of people in Africa remember that. So try and do what we do well and not try and do everything under the sun. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Dorwal.
Have a mic, please. Thank you. First, to add to what Ravi said, congratulations to the team on some excellent work. Learned something listening to all of you. My sense, and this is a comment, not a question first, and then a question, that China's idea of order is a pecking order. You get what I'm trying to say? It's a pecking order. Who's where? As long as you fall within that pecking order, you're fine. Unfortunately for India, it doesn't quite agree with China on that pecking order. We have not agreed with it for a long time. So therefore, some sense of, countries going in slightly different directions. Without getting into India's economic interaction with China and who is dependent on whom and to what extent and how we can change that or should we change that, can we really ignore? Tino said, I'll answer the question on Operation Sindoor without answering. I'm sorry. That's too late for that now. You cannot have real-time collaboration between China and Pakistan on where to hit and whom to hit and how to hit and with what to hit. It's a bit late now to say that we can discuss what is going on in South Asia in general and India, China in particular, without taking into account exactly the ramifications. I'm not even going to Galwan in 2020 and where the situation is in Ladakh, but that introduces an element of uncertainty going forward. You'll notice I'm using the word uncertainty rather than a harsher word. So I leave that to the panel to think about. Can we think in terms of these interactions? China is doing very well, excellent. It is the world's largest economy, I say, in purchasing power parity terms, which is the correct way to look at it, not in terms of US dollars, but of course, in per capita terms, it is still way behind Europe and the US. But let's forget all that. But in South Asia, if anyone in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka or in Maldives or in Nepal or in Bhutan feel that they can expect India to ignore this kind of real-time collusion between a country which is run by a general, well, sorry, I take that back, by a field marshal. So that may be not quite understanding how things will evolve in the future.
Ambassador Sood.
Let me also add my congratulations for the report and an excellent conversation that the panel has given us today. What I wanted to ask, China has I mean, Constantino, you said that China has always been present in this region, historically, etc., etc. Well, I would say that to an extent, China can take benefit from being an insider, but I think also from being an outsider. In a sense, it has to learn the language. Let me put it like this. India is not an outsider in this region. It is only an insider as far as this region is concerned. That brings with it its own disadvantages in a sense. Emotion becomes an element in disagreements, which it probably doesn't. I don't know. Would that be a fair assessment? Yes, no? Have you had any thoughts on that in the group?
Thank you, sir. We'll first do first round of responses and then we'll come to the audience again. So, Dr. Xavier, we'll start with you. Why don't you address Ambassador Sood's question?
No, I agree. Sure. Yes, I think the grass is always greener on the other side. I think from, again, my engagements across the region over the last, say, 16 to 19, 20, the grass was more than green on the other side. I mean, everything was, it was heaven, China. It was far away. It was amazing. It was ever-giving. It was supportive. It did everything that no one else did. But what I see, and I think maybe Professor Yasmin, I think I'd like to hear more from you and George, both of you in Dhaka, is that I think the grass doesn't look as green anymore. So the same people in 16, 17 would tell me, look, China is amazing and has this outsider advantage, like you rightly point out. I think are realizing also that China is just another player, another rational, self-seeking, interested actor. And that comes with costs that they have to navigate very carefully. And to your point about disadvantage of proximity, I mean, what did the Sri Lankans do when we saw the first financial default in an Asian country since 1997? A massive default at the doorsteps of India. They called Delhi. It was India who supported. It was expected to come in and support it and deliver the assistance that kept the Sri Lankan economy floating and today slowly resuscitating. What happened in the Maldives? Right? When the Maldives did not know how much they owed the Chinese, they requested a swap and a loan from India. So I think absolutely the burden, the moral hazard, if I may put it, of being the insider is huge. Yeah, but that's how it is. I mean, and that's how China is therefore plays conveniently, sometimes with the insider, we're with you, we're going to balance you, we're going to support you. Sometimes they say we can't do much. Or I think another aphorism I learned in my study, when you have a fire at your doorstep, I mean, go to closed waters, don't go to distant waters. That's what the Chinese said in the 1980s to the Sri Lankans. We can't deal with this, you deal with the Indians. Right? We are the distant waters, the grass is green. So absolutely, I think that is an advantage for China. But also I see a lot of realization across the neighborhood that these disadvantages are becoming costly for these countries too. And therefore also a re-engagement with India and other partners, by the way, whether we talk about Japan, Australia, the US, the EU, with all its limitations and ups and downs, down for the US for sure these days. But there's also many other players that they need to engage that are also outside the region, but at the same time, very important in shaping the future of this region.
I would just like to add slightly to this definition of insider and outsider changing. If the Chinese, what we find out in our study of Chinese speeches, the very definition of South, what counts as a South Asian region, is being redefined. Or when you talk about the Himalayan belt, and Shivnada University, of course, has a Himalayan Studies Center where you're looking at countries above and down the Himalayas, and you see that then the central focus of South Asia changes. It's not India anymore. It moves northwards, and different regions can be imagined. So this insider-outsider definition, again, is in flux. But Professor Yasmin and Mr. Pope, would you agree with Dr. Xavier's assessment here? Professor Yasmin, why don't you go first?
I thought George will talk first, but yeah, it's very interesting way of putting or seeing relationships in terms of insider and outsider. I would rather argue that is the outsider who is learning the trade of the trick quite fast than the insider. And because often we think being an insider, I know what there is. Often things are taken for granted. But as we have seen in the case of India's Bangladesh policy, it was a total failure because it took the party-state relationship, for granted, which was not the case. And we have seen how what people want, how one election after the other since 2014 was completely illegitimate, and this was not recognized by India or many other countries, gradually. So I think being an insider has its pitfalls as well, and I think it needs to be recognized.
Mr. Pope.
Definitely, there is a distinct difference between the insider and the outsider in this case in terms of South Asia. But we also need to be mindful that when it comes to ideology, when it comes to governance, when it comes to structure, there is so much of difference between the insider and the outsider. If you take a country like Sri Lanka has a lot more in common with India than it does with China. We have a long-standing history with China, true, but of course we have a very intricate history going back many centuries with a country like India. But this is where we're looking at the modern context. We're looking at things that are very contemporary. We're looking at issues that are coming up in the 21st century. We rely on history, we study our history, we understand history, but we need to understand what is going on in this scenario right now. And maybe this is not the platform to raise up that issue, but in that kind of scenario, what do we see happening here? When you look at bilateral relations and you look at the two countries that we're talking about here, you have instances in the past where there have been transgressions with China as well. It's not like everything has been smooth right throughout. But of course, jump now into 2025, 2024, coming to the first quarter of this century, we are grappling in Sri Lanka. We're hearing about this on a daily basis. Maybe in Delhi, you're not hearing about this. We're talking about the massive fishing issue that we're facing. The northern fishermen is facing a very critical situation. The rights of the Tamil community there are being taken away by large-scale fishing vessels, fishing merchants, fishing businesses. I purposely wouldn't use the word fishermen because these are not small fishermen coming in small boats. This is a much bigger issue that we're dealing with, and that is dominating the discourse. That is what we are hearing about all the time. Now, what has been done to address that by both sides? This has to be revisited. This is just one issue that, I mean, we don't need to go deep into that, but this is the kind of thing that happens at that stage. You would expect our two countries to be able to resolve this given our common ideology, our governance, our structures, our relations, but that's not happening. So this is then raising a question as to why that is not happening. And it's a problem that has to be addressed. It's a perennial issue. It's something that's going back a long time. But of course, that's very much state to state. But when it comes to that form of engagement across the board, for example, we reach out to Tino reaches out to us, we engage. We are in the process of engaging. This is wonderful. So it's happening with academia, with think tanks, educational institutions. That is going on. But at the same time, we're seeing a much more vigorous campaign on the other side, from the outside. Because the outsider realizes they have got to do a lot more in order to get in. They've got to do a lot more than the insider does. So
Thank
if
you
it's
so
Lanka, with any of our countries, there is a lot more they have to do, and bet you they're doing it.
Thank you for sharing the perspective from Colombo. I'll come to Professor Jacob to address Mr. Bhuthalingam's question.
All right. So, I mean, influence operations has a very specific connotation. Yes, it is sinister. I mean, if it weren't, we would use the expression people to people contacts. So there is a very clear definition. It is illegitimate. It is illegal in many ways. It is coercive. And that's a study that my colleague Devendra has about Tibetan diaspora being coerced by the Chinese, I mean, extraterritorially. So it is what it is. To Ambassador Bhagwati, I mean, yes, pecking order. I mean, it's understood. Those of us who sort of follow China, when the Chinese say harmony or harmonious world, harmonious society, it's implicit. It's not harmony in the Western music sense, where all four parts sing together. This harmony is possible only if there is a pecking order, as you put it. So there is hierarchy. It's very much built into the system. But I think more than just sort of rely on what it is historically or culturally, I think the Chinese are also very much aware of what the modern world looks like. And I think that's a point, I think Ambassador Sood makes a very important point, that we in India tend to be emotional about these things, whether the Chinese are looking at it as rational actors. I mean, the Chinese look at Japan rationally. Yes, they play up the rape of Nanjing and all of that. But I think when it comes to actual policy on Japan, it's very rationally thought out. And they put the pressure points, I mean, they put pain points and pressure points. Maybe it looks emotional, but it is very, very rationally thought out. So I think there it comes to the question of, I think, definitions of what a region is. So, I mean, Shruti mentioned the Center for Himalayan Studies, which are direct. So we call it Himalayan Studies, but we are looking at actually Central Asia as well. And one of the reasons why that has happened is because where is an Institute of Central Asian Studies here? I mean, again, to come back to the point of an insider-outsider, for an insider, we seem to take our understanding of our region for granted. I mean, there's one Institute of Chinese Studies, and there are a couple of other think tanks that are focused on China, but maybe that's because we are not emotionally invested in China. The moment we're emotionally invested, we tend to leave actual studies of, I mean, there's an Institute of Nepal Studies, I think, in Banaras, but there used to be. There's no Institute of Pakistan Studies.
Pakistan.
Yeah, and there is no Institute of Bangladesh Studies. So, well, now that you mentioned that, I have to say from my vantage point, I say, what the hell are these guys fighting about? Right. So, I think the reason why the Chinese are entered this region, and as I think Mr. Cook puts it very well, is that they have realized that as an outsider, they have to put in the effort. And they have actually put in fantastic amount of academic resources. Now, I have two of my students here. Dia has just finished. Dia, I mean, did you take Chinese language in the university? No. So, I mean, I failed as a teacher. I mean, we have 3 Chinese language teachers at SNU, and we have a full-fledged program or rather several courses on China. So why is it that our students are not putting in this effort to study China or the Chinese language? I think that's the difference between Indian students and Chinese students, I suppose. And you are also, are you taking my course? Yes. You're going to take my course. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the only way I can put pressure on these guys. So, yeah, that's.
Okay, so we have run out of time, but we'll have just another set of questions, 2. So, General Mehta.
The mic.
Thank you.
It's on.
Yeah, it's on.
All right. It's on. Thank you. I'll ask the questions first and then make my comments. The question is that why is nobody from Nepal on this panel? you had pointed out some projects you've done. You have nobody.
Not today.
Okay, so you'll do it
Yeah.
separately.
We
Yeah.
have been holding seminars for each of these specific chapters where we have last seminar we had speakers from Nepal.
Okay.
So
All right. This question of language just come out of Nepal last week and traveled a fair amount. All the language teachers have gone back. All the Mandarin teachers have gone back from Nepal. Nobody speaks Chinese language in Nepal. Instead, there is a whole amount of fear. The word fear has not been used. If there's one country where the Chinese have not influence, but brought in fear, and that fear is visible when it comes to the Tibetan community, especially, which about 30,000 reside there. So I'm not sure whether there is fear in Bangladesh or in Bhutan. Certainly there is, in what you described as the Himalayan belt. So I thought these fear language and there is also a lot of interference, political interference. I think nobody's talked. I'm focusing on Nepal particularly. I see that happening that is happening in Pakistan. That is happening in Bangladesh now. But it's very prominent as far as Nepal is concerned, as far as and their effort, they used to Nepal. The Chinese used to tell the Nepalese till 2007-8, before the Maoist movement started, that you rely on India. So the general division in South Asia, the model that South Asian countries ought to follow is what is happening in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has constantly said that for security, we look to India, almost constantly said. And that is the model that India, because of its proximity, because you call India an insider and China an intruder. China is an intruder, not an outsider. And if India had the capacity, if India had the regional influence and the power and the capacity, we would have been able to ward off the Chinese. And so let me make my last point, that you will see far more of the Chinese influence in this part of the world, our part of the world. And their deep pockets. And that is why, which we do not have. And we cannot compete with the Chinese.
thank you so much for those very sharp questions. Dhara, please go ahead. And I would request you to keep your questions direct.
When one looks at China's media outreach in South Asia, India seems to be sort of the outlier. Because since Galwan, if one notices the social media posts or even just embassy information pages, we see that the effectiveness of its messaging is rather limited. So how does then one decode China's media outreach or diplomacy in this case? Is it just using selective engagement to specific groups like students or businessmen, particularly like as transmitting information on, say, visas, for instance? Or is it looking at adopting a more reactive policy? How does one really decode China's media outreach in India?
Thank you so much. Professor Jacob and then Dr. Xavier.
Okay, I'll answer Dhara's question. I think the first order of business for the Chinese is visibility. I mean, this is where this insider, outsider, intruder element comes in. Because they need to build up their cachet in the region, so they decide first and foremost, let us make ourselves visible. So the Chinese ambassador writes in the Indian press, he writes in Sinhala press, Tamil press, whatever. And so they are not primarily looking at effectiveness there. For effectiveness, I think they still rely very heavily on government to government connections. All right. In fact, I think the lesson that Op Sindoor and 10 years of CPEC gives us is that the China-Pakistan relationship is back to basics. They decided to complicate a perfectly well-oiled political-military relationship with the Pakistanis by introducing the economic element. And they tried it for 10 years. I think they'll keep trying. But I think the Chinese decided that they didn't want to be over-dependent on just the Pakistani elite, military and political elite, so got into the business side of it. And I think they've covered some ground, but now they're back to the military relationship. So, I mean, I mean, look, they are trying many things. We can't look at the effectiveness of what China is doing only through the social media posts, only through the scholarships and fellowships for scholars, only through media engagement. There's a lot of things that need to be added up together to figure out what's going on.
Thank you. Dr. Xavier.
Yeah, on this insider-outsider, while defer again to the utility of this paradigm, insider-outsider, and I explained why India has sometimes disadvantages in insider, also advantages, and China has advantages and disadvantages in outsider. I think this distinction is being blurred very fast, and it's one of the main learnings of our case study. Again, when I spend time in these places across the neighborhood, there are very few things that are significant in these countries: economic decisions, political decisions, governance decisions, security and military decisions that do not have the Chinese footprint on them, or fingerprint, if you want. So it's very difficult these days to imagine significant decisions, policy choices being made in these countries that do not have a China inbuilt calculation by these countries. So by that definition, China is an insider today. This does not apply to most European actors in the neighborhood. This does not apply to Japan. Maybe here and there, Japan is part of some calculations. The United States of America, which was the other significant player, I risk saying is becoming insignificant because it doesn't have the teeth, the instruments, the tools, the methods that it developed and deployed over 70 or 100 years, including to the detriment of India sometimes, maybe today again. But it certainly doesn't have the instruments, or less instruments or shape. So that, I just leave that as an invitation for us to think about China as what I've called resident power in South Asia, in this region. So ergo, it is very difficult to design any response if we ignore that. Any response from Delhi, future Washington, or future Tokyo, or any other player, multilateral development banks that are active in this field, NGOs, media, will have to factor that in, that the Chinese are today one important player when it comes to decide who's going to be the next Prime Minister of Nepal. Who's going to be the next, what is the shape of the next, financial instrument that Sri Lanka or Bangladesh design for their people? And I think that has huge consequences. And I think that is the most important learning, I think, is China is a resident power. Maybe more or less we don't see, but what is there for it? And therefore, let me just end on this as an implication. It will be very costly for us to do the same things by not talking to each other. You asked that question about what does it mean for other countries? So on media, for example, Dara, if we think about the media sector, which is something that India believes in is important, India has trained thousands of journalists across the global south, tens of thousands over the last 50, 75 years. It still does, right? And is comfortable with it and shares a space that is an open media space. However noisy and shrill, we may not like it sometimes, but it's an open space. And I think if you want to design that in other countries, support these countries in their media transparency or in their think tank research, then I think also communicating more with each other, whether it's US, India, Japan, India, Europe, I see Austria here, maybe other countries that are interested in that share these values, then maybe we should talk a little bit more with each other and coordinate instead of just saying China is bad and we'll do our little thing against it or an alternative. The alternative needs to be a collective of alternatives. Not the same response. There will be differences between the US and India, as we know in Bangladesh, for example, on the shape of the future of the democratic governance in Bangladesh. but certainly there needs to be more coordination, communication, how we respond things that are in line with what Bangladesh wants and needs and requires, instead of replicating and doing redundancy of similar efforts that, are a waste of resources and attention, frankly.
Okay, final comments from Mr. Cook and then Professor Yasmin.
Thank you. Certainly the dialogue has been very rich and a lot has been said already. And I guess two of the most important things that we always tend to take away from these situations is this consistent engagement. This is engagement across the board. It might not only be with one sector, with one area, one sphere of activity in our country, for example, but there's consistent engagement and it's multi-pronged. It's a multi-pronged approach. And there's absolutely no doubt that the format of foreign policy engaged in by the People's Republic of China is a strategized foreign policy. It is not a system in which it's done in an ad hoc basis. There's not just planning done. It goes much beyond planning. There's a strategy involved. There are goals involved. There's the achievement of those goals. There's a review of that process that is very clear. And these are lessons for all of our countries to take away. These are things for all of us to look at. Quite interestingly, when we talk about ideology, we have not come across situations in which communism is being spread through any of the programs that we have experienced in Sri Lanka. There might be engagement with the Communist Party, but that aside, in programs in universities, think tanks, private sector chambers, there's no talk about communism. That is no situation in which ideology is being spread. This is clearly soft power being used in a very effective manner, and it is highly advantageous for the user. And the user is gaining a lot out of it simply because they have a clear strategy, and that strategy is being taken to a much higher level.
Thank you. Professor Yasmin.
Thank you. Yeah, I would start with referring back to your Foreign Minister Jaishankar's comment that this is a plurilateral world where countries have to fend for themselves. And in this plurilateral world, in fact, for Bangladesh, it's extremely significant. Who can we get the best out of from? So every actor, we understand that every actor comes with an interest. There's nothing called altruism in international politics. So we have to see how far we can have a China's engagement. And at the same time, despite many rhetoric that you will find around, it is understandable for Bangladesh that it is, on three sides surrounded by India. So maintaining a working relationship, maintaining a cordial relationship is in the interest of both India and Bangladesh. China is seen in a different domain. We do not see China, India, Bangladesh in a trilateral setting. We merit bilateral relationships, in their own sort of, weight or the kind of way they can engage with us. But of course, as we have noticed that recently there has been sort of a dissatisfaction about how the last 15 and a half years were sustained by active support from India, and how India would not go beyond the 1971 narrative, whether they would listen to people or listen to party representatives of a specific political party. And then, of course, as something that has been pointed out, I think Professor Xavier and also Constantino, that there are not many Bangladesh experts in India. We see only few faces and who are driven by a particular kind of ideology. Then I would request that instead of, to go beyond rhetoric, and instead of listening to sort of extremist views on both sides, look at what the independent media, for example, BBC, for example, CNN, for example, Al Jazeera or ABC Australia, BBC Verified Live clearly showed that how many of the, anti-Bangladeshi propaganda was coming from a specific origin. And those were, sort of misinformation against Bangladesh. So I would suggest that, we need to rebuild our relationship on the basis of what people want, what is beneficial for ourselves, instead of looking at third party. just the way India talks about bilateralism with our relationship with China, or for that matter with Australia, Japan, and America, is extremely robust. And we find it extremely significant when scholars from outside writes that Bangladesh is no longer a small country; it's a middle power, and certainly all the parties concerned must have to understand it's not the Bangladesh of 1970s. A lot of changes have taken place, and Bangladesh is willing to sort of ask for its share from its neighbors and its friends. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed, it's not even the Bangladesh of 2024, but it has been an extremely enriching discussion. I can say that for myself, and by the smiles on your faces, I can say that for the audience also. I would like to thank Mr. Cook and Professor Yasmin for taking the time to join us today. And of course, to the editors, Professor Jacob and Dr. Xavier, who have put together this excellent report for all of us. And finally, a big thanks to all of you for staying over time. We have tea and snacks outside, and I hope the conversations about engagement across the region and beyond can be carried forward there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.